The wind cut across the open snow like a blade that had forgotten mercy. It howled through the pine trees and rolled over the white hills in long, lonely waves. The cowboy pulled his coat tighter and lowered his hat against the sting of ice in the air. His horse snorted, breath rising in thick clouds, each step crunching deep into the frozen earth. Winter had swallowed the land whole, and on mornings like this, a man could ride for miles without seeing so much as a rabbit track. He had been following the river bend when he noticed something strange ahead. At first he thought it was only branches sagging under snow. The trees here were heavy with it, bent low like old men bowing to the cold. But then the horse stiffened beneath him. Animals see what men miss. The cowboy narrowed his eyes and leaned forward in the saddle. There, beneath a tall pine at the edge of the clearing, shapes hung against the pale sky. His heart dropped before his mind could catch up. Two figures were suspended from a thick branch. An old native grandmother wrapped in a worn blanket, and beside her, a small child with bare feet brushing the frozen air. Their heads hung low, dark hair frozen stiff against their faces. The rope that held them creaked in the wind. For a moment the world stood still. The only sound was the groan of trees and the restless shift of his horse. The cowboy felt a tightness in his chest he had not known since the war years. This land had seen hard winters and harder men, but this was something else. This was cruelty laid bare in the snow. He slid from the saddle so fast his boots nearly slipped. His gloved hands trembled as he tied the reins to a low branch. He stepped closer, every breath sharp and loud in his ears. He feared what he might find, feared being too late. The old woman's face was lined deep with years and weather. Ice clung to her silver braids. The child's red scarf fluttered weakly in the wind, the only bright color in a world gone white. The cowboy reached up carefully, his fingers brushing the child's wrist, warm, faint, but warm. He let out a breath he did not know he was holding. They were alive. The rope had been looped in a cruel way, binding them under their arms rather than around their necks, leaving them hanging just enough that their toes barely touched the ground. It was a slow punishment, one meant to let the cold do its work. Whoever had done this had not cared whether they lived or died, only that they suffered. The cowboy moved quickly now. He lifted the child first, easing the weight off the rope. The small body was light as a bundle of sticks. The child stirred faintly, a soft breath against his coat. He worked the rope free with stiff fingers and lowered the child gently into the snow before catching the grandmother the same way. When both were free, he wrapped them in his own heavy coat and blanket from the saddle. He rubbed their hands, their arms, careful not to press too hard against frozen skin. He spoke softly, though he did not know if they could hear him. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough from cold and something deeper. "I've got you." The grandmother's eyelids fluttered first. Dark eyes, sharp even through pain, met his. There was no fear in them, only a quiet strength. She studied him as if weighing his soul in a single glance. The child coughed weakly, small fingers gripping his sleeve. That simple touch struck him harder than the sight of the ropes had. He had spent most of his life riding alone, drifting from cattle drives to small-town jobs, keeping to himself. He knew the land better than he knew people. Yet, in that moment, kneeling in the snow beside two strangers, he felt something shift inside him. The West was changing. Railroads cut through hunting grounds. Settlers built fences where buffalo once roamed. Tension hung thicker than the winter fog between cowboys and native tribes. He had seen anger on both sides. He had kept out of it when he could, telling himself it was not his fight. But this was not about land or law. This was about right and wrong. He built a quick fire using dry wood from beneath the trees. Smoke curled into the cold sky. He warmed water from his canteen and helped them sip slowly. The grandmother tried to sit up, but he shook his head gently. "Easy," he said. "You've been through enough." She spoke at last, her voice thin but steady. Her words were in her own tongue at first, soft and musical. He did not understand them, but he understood the tone. It carried both sorrow and gratitude. After a moment, she shifted to broken English. "Bad men," she said simply. He nodded. He did not ask who. He had his suspicions. There were ranch hands in these parts who blamed every lost calf on native hunters. There were men who believed fear was a tool to keep others away. Snow hid tracks quickly, but not everything could be buried. The child clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. The cowboy felt the small heartbeat against his chest. It was fragile and fierce at the same time. As the fire grew, color slowly returned to their faces. The grandmother reached out and touched his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You see us," she said. He did not know how to answer that. He had only done what any decent man should do. Yet something in her words felt larger, as if she spoke of more than this single morning. The wind began to settle, leaving behind a deep, ringing silence. Snowflakes drifted lazily now instead of slicing sideways. The clearing looked peaceful again, almost innocent if not for the rope still swaying from the pine branch. He cut it down and threw it into the fire. It hissed and twisted as flames consumed it. "We need to move," he said. "There's a cabin not far from here." "It's small, but it's warm." The grandmother studied him once more, measuring trust. Finally, she gave a slow nod. He lifted the child onto the saddle and helped the old woman mount behind. He walked beside the horse instead of riding, keeping a steady hand on the reins. The trail to his cabin was narrow and half-buried, but he knew every bend and rock by heart. As they moved through the trees, he could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest held its breath. Ravens circled high above, black shapes against white sky. When they reached the cabin, smoke no longer rose from the chimney. He had left the fire banked before riding out at dawn. Now he hurried to stoke it back to life. Inside, the room was plain but clean, a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed. He spread blankets by the hearth and helped them settle close to the warmth. The child's eyes opened fully for the first time. They were dark and deep, reflecting firelight like polished stone. The cowboy offered a weak smile. "You're strong," he said. The child did not speak, but the grip on his hand tightened. Hours passed as the storm drifted away. The grandmother spoke little, saving her strength. When she did, she told him they had been traveling to meet family before spring. They had camped near the river. Men came at night, faces hidden. Words harsh and full of blame. They had been dragged away before dawn. He listened in silence, jaw set. Each word was a coal dropped into his chest. As evening fell, the sky outside turned pink and gold, beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel after what the day had shown. He stepped outside for air. The snow reflected the fading light, glowing soft and calm. But near the tree line he saw fresh tracks, boot prints, more than one pair. They led toward the cabin. His hand moved slowly to the revolver at his hip. The peaceful quiet of the clearing no longer felt gentle. It felt like the pause before a storm breaks. Inside, the grandmother lifted her head slightly, as if she sensed the change in the air. The child watched him from the hearth, eyes wide but steady. The cowboy stood between the door and the fire, listening. Somewhere beyond the trees, a branch snapped under weight. The wind had died completely now. There was no sound to hide approaching footsteps. He knew then that saving them from the cold had only been the beginning. The real test was riding straight toward him, boots crunching through snow, carrying the same darkness that had left 2 innocent souls hanging beneath a pine. He tightened his grip and drew a slow breath. What followed would not only decide their fate, but perhaps the kind of man he truly was. The branch snapped again, closer this time. The cowboy did not rush to throw the door open. He had lived too long on open land to mistake fear for courage. Instead, he stepped back into the cabin and eased the door shut without sound. The fire popped behind him, filling the small room with a soft orange glow. He kept his voice low and steady. "Stay close to the hearth," he said. The grandmother watched him carefully. She did not panic. Her weathered hands rested on the child's shoulders, holding steady. There was a calm about her that did not match the fear in the air. It was the calm of someone who had seen storms before and knew that shouting at the sky never helped. Outside, boots pressed into snow, slow, measured. He crossed the room and blew out the lantern on the table, leaving only the firelight. Shadows stretched long across the walls. His cabin was small enough that a single step could bring trouble inside. He moved toward the window and lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see. 3 men stood near the tree line. Their hats were pulled low, heavy coats. Rifles slung over shoulders, they were not in a hurry. That unsettled him more than if they had charged forward shouting. One of them pointed toward the cabin. The cowboy felt the weight of the moment settle deep in his bones. He recognized one of the men by the way he stood, slightly crooked on his left leg. A ranch hand from a spread south of the river. A man who spoke loudly in town about stolen cattle and broken fences. A man who blamed every hardship on the nearest tribe. The tracks he had seen by the pine were not from strangers passing through. They were from men who believed they owned this land and everyone on it. He let the curtain fall and turned back toward the fire. "They found us," he said quietly. The child's eyes widened but did not cry. The grandmother gave a slow nod, as if she had expected this from the moment the rope had been cut. "You help us," she said. "They not like that," he swallowed. It was true. In a place where fear ruled, kindness could look like betrayal. A knock struck the door, hard enough to shake it in its frame. "Open up," a voice called out. "We saw your horse." The cowboy walked to the door but did not unlatch it. "What do you want?" he asked. "Just neighborly talk," the same voice answered, with a thin edge of mockery. "Heard there were some runaways about." His jaw tightened. He kept his tone even. "No runaways here, just me and my fire." Silence followed. Snow shifted under boots, then a second voice spoke, colder. "We saw tracks." "Small ones." The cowboy glanced at the floor behind him, where melting snow from the grandmother's shoes had darkened the wood. He had not thought to wipe it clean. "Tracks lead everywhere in winter," he said. "Wind fills them just the same." A long pause stretched between them. He could feel their eyes on the door, weighing options. He knew men like this, prideful, certain of their own story. They would not walk away easily. The latch rattled under a testing hand. His grip tightened around the revolver, though he kept it low at his side. He did not want this to turn into something worse. The land had seen enough blood in its soil. "You best move on," he said. "Storm's coming back?" One of the men laughed softly. "Storm's already here," he replied. The grandmother shifted slightly, her blanket rustling. The child pressed closer to her side. The cowboy felt the weight of their trust like a stone in his chest. He had chosen this the moment he cut that rope. There was no stepping aside now. Boots crunched again. The men did not force the door. Instead, they circled the cabin slowly. He heard them near the back wall, then by the small window on the far side. They were testing him, seeing how far he would go. He moved toward the hearth and crouched beside the grandmother. "There's a trapdoor under that rug," he whispered. "Leads to a crawl space. Not big, but it'll hide you for a while." She studied him, searching his face. "You stay?" she asked. He nodded. "I stay." The child's small hand caught his sleeve again. That simple grip held more fear than tears ever could. He forced a faint smile. "You're braver than most grown men I know," he said softly. He lifted the rug and opened the narrow hatch. Cold air drifted up from below. It was not comfortable, but it was hidden. He helped them down carefully. The grandmother moved slowly, joints stiff from cold and age, but her eyes never left his. "Whatever happens," she said, "you remember this day." Before he could answer, a heavy fist pounded against the back wall. He closed the hatch and dropped the rug back in place just as the front door shook again under a hard kick. "Last chance," a voice called out. "Open it." He stood straight, shoulders squared, and walked to the door. He slid the revolver into plain sight but kept it lowered. When he opened it, the cold rushed in along with three hard faces. The crooked-legged ranch hand looked past him into the cabin. "You alone?" he asked. "That's what I said." The man's gaze swept the room. Fire, table, bed, nothing more. He stepped forward without invitation, boots leaving wet prints across the floor. The other two followed. They moved like wolves sniffing for weakness. One paused near the hearth, staring at the rug. The cowboy's heart thudded once, heavy and loud in his ears. "You been riding far?" The second man asked. "Far enough," he answered. The crooked-legged man bent slightly, brushing a hand near the floor where melted snow had dried. "Looks like you had company." Horse kicked snow inside, the cowboy said evenly. "Happens." The man straightened and locked eyes with him. "You always this helpful to strangers?" he asked. The question carried more than curiosity. It carried accusation. "I help who needs helping," the cowboy replied. Silence stretched thick between them. The fire cracked loudly, breaking the stillness. One of the men walked toward the small window and looked out. "Tracks come here," he muttered. "And they leave?" the crooked man asked. The cowboy did not answer. A long moment passed. The men seemed to weigh their next move. They could tear the cabin apart. They could search every inch. Or they could decide the trouble was not worth it. The crooked man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you're doing something noble," he said. "But this land's changing. There's no room for old ways anymore." The cowboy felt heat rise in his chest. "Maybe that's the problem," he said quietly. The man's jaw tightened. For a second, it looked as if he might reach for his rifle. Instead, he gave a thin smile that never touched his eyes. "We'll be watching," he said. "Storm's not done." They turned and stepped back out into the snow. The door closed behind them with a hollow thud. The cowboy did not move for several long seconds. He listened to the fading crunch of boots, waiting until the sound disappeared into the trees. Only then did he kneel and lift the rug. "It's clear," he whispered. The grandmother emerged slowly, the child right behind her. The small space had chilled them again, but they were safe for now. For now, the grandmother settled by the fire once more. Her gaze drifted to the window where fading light slipped through. "They afraid," she said softly. "Afraid of what?" he asked. "Losing what they think is theirs." He sat back on his heels, considering her words. Fear could twist men into something unrecognizable. He had seen it before when the railroad first cut across open prairie. Some men adapted, others clung to anger like a shield. "They won't stop," he admitted. She nodded slowly. "You won't either." The statement caught him off guard. He had never seen himself as a man who stood for causes. He rode, he worked, he kept his head down. But something about that pine tree in the snow had drawn a line he could not step back across. The child spoke for the first time, voice small but steady. "Why they hate us?" The question hung heavy in the warm room. The cowboy searched for an answer that would not wound further. "Sometimes people fear what they don't understand," he said carefully. "And sometimes they're told stories that aren't true." The child looked at the fire, thinking. "My grandmother says stories can heal," the child said. The old woman smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "But first, someone must listen." Outside, clouds began gathering again over the hills. The light faded faster than it should have. The cowboy stepped to the window and watched as wind lifted loose snow into thin spirals. He knew the men would not forget this visit. Pride alone would not allow it. And if word spread through town that he had given shelter to a native grandmother and child, his own place in this valley might shrink quickly. Yet when he looked back at the firelit faces behind him, he felt no regret. Only a growing sense that this winter held more than cold. As night settled in, a distant sound carried through the trees. Not boots this time. Not wind, hoofbeats, more than one horse. They were approaching from the far side of the clearing, slow and deliberate. The grandmother's eyes lifted before he even spoke. The child's hand found his again. The cowboy moved toward the door, every sense sharp. The day he thought would pass like any other had turned into something larger than himself. And whatever rode through that darkening snow now would test the promise he had made beneath a hanging pine. He reached for the latch, unsure of who waited beyond it, but certain of one thing. The storm was far from over. The hoofbeats drew closer, steady and unhurried, as if whoever rode through the snow had no reason to hide. The cowboy kept his hand on the latch but did not open the door right away. He listened to the rhythm of the horses, counting at least 4 this time. The sound came from the north side of the clearing, not the direction the ranch hands had gone. Behind him, the fire cracked softly. The grandmother sat upright now, her eyes no longer tired but sharp and alert. The child stood beside her, small shoulders squared in a way that did not match such young years. The cowboy opened the door just enough to see. 4 riders emerged from the trees, their shapes dark against the pale snow. They wore heavy blankets and carried themselves differently than the men who had just left, quiet, careful. Their horses stepped lightly, trained for forest trails instead of open range. One rider raised a hand, not in threat but in greeting. The cowboy stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. Cold air wrapped around him again, biting through his coat. He kept his posture calm, though his mind raced. The lead rider spoke first, voice low and steady. "We are looking for our family." The cowboy studied him. There was no anger in his tone, only concern. The man's gaze shifted briefly toward the cabin, then back. "They're safe," the cowboy said. "Inside," relief flickered across the rider's face, quick but real. The other three dismounted at once, moving toward the cabin without haste yet without delay. The cowboy lifted a hand. "Easy," he said. "There are men in this valley who don't want you here, ranch hands." "They were just at my door," the lead rider nodded slowly. "We saw their tracks," he said. "They ride loud. They want to be seen." The cowboy stepped aside and opened the door fully this time. When the grandmother saw the riders, her expression softened in a way it had not since morning. One of the men rushed forward and knelt beside her, speaking in their own language, his voice trembling. The child ran into his arms. The cabin, once heavy with tension, filled with quiet emotion, relief, fear, gratitude, all tangled together. The cowboy stood near the door, watching. He felt like an outsider in his own home, yet he did not mind. Something about seeing the reunion eased a tight place inside him. But relief did not erase danger. The lead rider turned toward him. "They say you cut them down," he said. "I did. You know this brings trouble?" "I already saw that." The man studied him, weighing more than just words. "Why help us?" he asked. The cowboy hesitated. He could have said it was the right thing to do. He could have shrugged and brushed it off, but the truth felt simpler than that. "I couldn't ride away," he said. The rider gave a slow nod, as if that answer was enough. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying loose snow across the clearing. The sky had darkened to a deep gray. Night would fall fast. "We cannot stay," one of the younger riders said. "More will come." The cowboy knew he was right. The ranch hands would not be satisfied with a single warning. They would gather others, men in town who believed they were protecting their land. Men who told themselves harsh acts were necessary for order. "You have somewhere to go?" the cowboy asked. The lead rider looked toward the hills. "Our camp is far," he said. "Too far for the grandmother to ride tonight." The old woman's back was straight, but her hands trembled slightly in the firelight. The cold had taken its toll. The child watched the adults closely, sensing the weight of each decision. The cowboy thought of the valley beyond the ridge. An abandoned trading post near the frozen creek. Few people went there now. It was hidden by rock and trees, sheltered from wind. "There's a place east of here," he said. "Old cabin near the creek bend. Not much, but it will hold against weather. If you leave now, you can reach it before midnight." The riders exchanged glances. "And you?" the lead rider asked. "I'll stay," the cowboy said. "If the ranch hands come back and find this place empty, they'll think you fled west." "That'll buy time?" The grandmother's eyes rested on him once more. "You stand alone," she said quietly. He gave a faint smile. "Been doing that most my life." The riders prepared quickly. Blankets were adjusted. The grandmother was helped gently onto a horse, the child seated in front of one of the younger men. Before leaving, the lead rider stepped close to the cowboy. "There are stories told about men like you," he said. "Men who walk between worlds? I'm no story," the cowboy replied. "Not yet," the rider said softly. They rode off into the falling dark, hooves muffled by fresh snow. The clearing grew silent again, but it was a different silence now, heavy, waiting. The cowboy returned inside and shut the door. The cabin felt emptier than before. The fire burned low, its warmth fading. He knew the ranch hands would return with more men. Word spread fast in small towns. By morning, this would no longer be about 2 lives saved in the snow. It would be about sides. He poured himself a cup of cold coffee from the pot on the stove and sat at the table. His mind drifted back years, to a time when he had first ridden into this valley. Back then fences were scarce. Men shared water and helped men roof before winter. Tension had always been there, quiet beneath the surface, but it had not ruled every conversation. Then came rumors of raids, missing cattle, broken traps. Each story grew sharper with retelling. No one stopped to ask who truly suffered most from the changes rolling across the land. He thought of the crooked-legged ranch hand. A man shaped by hardship, a man who believed he was defending his home. Fear had hardened him into something rigid. The cowboy understood that kind of fear. He had felt it himself when the railroad first pushed through his childhood town, scattering neighbors and bringing strangers. Change could make a man cling to whatever felt solid, even if that meant blaming others. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. This one was softer. He rose slowly and opened it. An older man stood on the porch, snow dusting his coat. The town preacher. "I saw riders," the preacher said quietly. "Heard talk in town?" The cowboy stepped aside to let him in. "You come to warn me?" he asked. In a manner of speaking, the preacher removed his hat and glanced around the cabin. His eyes lingered on the fire, then the damp floorboards. "You've stirred a hornet's nest," he said. "Seems so." The preacher sighed and sat at the table. "Men are gathering at the South Ranch," he said. "They say you're harboring trouble." "They're calling it a stand for order." The cowboy leaned against the wall. "Order built on what?" he asked. "On fear," the preacher answered. "And pride." Silence settled between them. "You planning to leave?" the preacher asked. The cowboy shook his head. "If I run now, it proves their story. And if you stay?" He looked toward the dark window. "Then we see what kind of valley this truly is." The preacher studied him, sadness in his eyes. "There are families in town who don't want this fight," he said. "But they are quiet. Quiet folk often are. Maybe they won't stay quiet forever," the cowboy replied. The preacher rose, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll speak what I can," he said. But words don't always travel far when anger rides faster. After he left, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The cowboy stepped outside once more. The moon had risen behind thin clouds, casting a pale glow over the snow. In the distance, faint lights flickered near the South Ranch, more than usual. He imagined the conversations happening there. Men around a stove, speaking of trespass and loyalty, convincing themselves they were protecting their way of life. He wondered how many of them had ever spoken to a native grandmother. How many had seen a child shivering beneath a pine tree? The wind shifted, carrying distant voices, laughter, then silence. He knew the coming days would test more than his resolve. Supplies could be cut off. Work could disappear. Neighbors could turn away. Inside, he gathered extra firewood and checked his rifle, not with eagerness but with caution. He hoped it would remain unused. As he settled into his chair near the door, he felt the weight of choice pressing on him. He had stepped into a line drawn long before this winter. A line between fear and understanding, between anger and mercy. Beyond the ridge, the grandmother and child rode through darkness toward uncertain shelter. In town, men whispered about making an example of someone. In the valley, snow continued to fall, covering tracks but not erasing them. The cowboy closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet. He sensed that this was no longer only about one rescue. It was about what kind of story this land would carry into spring. And somewhere out there, in the shifting snow and gathering tension, that story was still being written. By dawn, the valley no longer felt like home. It felt like a line drawn in snow. The cowboy had not slept. He sat in his chair through the night, listening to every creak of timber and shift of wind. When the first gray light crept through the window, he stepped outside and studied the land. Fresh tracks cut across the lower ridge, more than before. The men at the South Ranch had not wasted time. Smoke rose in thicker columns from town that morning. Wagons moved earlier than usual. Word had traveled fast. Some said he had sided with outsiders. Some said he had chosen a fight that did not belong to him. A few quieter voices called it something else, but they spoke behind closed doors. He saddled his horse with steady hands. If trouble was coming, he would meet it standing, not hiding. The snow had packed firm overnight, and the air carried that brittle stillness that comes before something breaks. Halfway down the trail toward town, he saw them. A line of riders stretched across the open field near the church. Ranch hands, hired guns, farm boys trying to look older than they were. They were not charging, they were waiting. At the front sat the crooked-legged ranch hand. His posture was stiff, his jaw set hard. Beside him stood the preacher, hat in hand, face drawn tight with worry. The cowboy rode forward alone. As he approached, the line of men shifted slightly, boots scraping in snow, horses stamping. Some would not meet his eyes. Others stared openly, daring him to flinch. "You planning to bring the valley to war?" The crooked man called out. "I'm planning to keep it from that," the cowboy answered calmly. A murmur rippled through the riders. "You sheltered them," the crooked man said. "That makes you part of it." "Part of what?" the cowboy asked. "Saving lives in the snow?" "They're not our people," another man muttered. The cowboy let that hang in the air for a moment. Then he spoke, not loud but steady enough to carry. "They're someone's grandmother." "Someone's child?" "That should be enough." The preacher stepped forward slightly. "This valley has survived hard winters before," he said. "We don't need to turn on each other now." But tension had already grown roots. One of the younger ranch hands leaned forward in his saddle. "They'll come back with more," he said. "You think they won't?" The cowboy held his gaze. "They were traveling to family. Not to fight. You can't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I know what I saw. I saw fear. I saw cold. I didn't see war." Silence pressed in heavy again. The crooked-legged man looked toward the hills. "Their riders were spotted near the creek," he said. "You tell them where to go?" The question was sharp. "I told them where they could rest," the cowboy replied. "That's the same thing." The air felt tight enough to snap. The line between both sides was no longer just about land. It was about pride. About who would step back first. Then, from beyond the ridge came a distant sound, hoofbeats, every head turned. From the east side of the valley, a small group of native riders appeared, moving slowly into the open. They did not carry rifles raised or weapons drawn. They rode in plain sight, steady and calm. At their center rode the grandmother, wrapped in blankets, upright despite her frailty. The child sat in front of her, chin lifted. The cowboy felt his breath catch. The crooked-legged man stiffened. "They're coming here," he muttered. The riders stopped at a respectful distance. No one spoke for several long moments. Snow drifted lightly between them. The lead native rider, the same one from the cabin, guided his horse forward alone. He stopped halfway between both groups. "We come to speak," he called out. A ripple of unease passed through the ranch hands. Speaking meant listening, and listening meant allowing doubt. The cowboy nudged his horse forward until he stood near the preacher. He did not cross into either side fully. He stood in the space between. The lead rider continued, voice clear in the cold air. "We did not come for cattle. We did not come for fences. We came for family." The grandmother lifted her hand slightly, a small gesture but strong. "They tried to hang us," she said, her voice thin but carrying, "not by rope of justice. By rope of fear." Some of the ranch hands shifted uncomfortably. The story had traveled through rumor, twisted into something different. Seeing her alive unsettled those half-believed tales. The crooked-legged man spoke again, louder this time. "You cross land that's not yours?" The lead rider's eyes did not waver. "Land remembers many footsteps." That answer stirred murmurs on both sides. The cowboy felt the weight of the valley pressing down. One wrong word could spark something none of them could pull back from. The preacher cleared his throat. "This valley has room for reason," he said, "or it has room for regret. We choose which." A young ranch hand at the far end tightened his grip on his reins. Fear flickered across his face, then doubt. The child suddenly slipped down from the horse and stepped forward into the snow. Gasps rose from both sides. The cowboy's heart nearly stopped. The child walked slowly, small boots crunching, until standing just ahead of the grandmother's horse. "We were cold," the child said, voice trembling but clear. "He cut us down." A small hand lifted and pointed toward the cowboy. "He didn't ask who we were. He just helped." That simple truth hung heavier than any accusation. The crooked-legged man opened his mouth to respond, but no words came at first. The moment had shifted. Not resolved, but shifted. Behind him, one of the older ranchers spoke quietly. "No one deserves that kind of end." It was not loud, but it was enough. Still, pride does not loosen easily. The crooked man's jaw hardened. "Kindness don't change what's coming," he said. "More settlers are riding in by spring. Lines will be drawn." "You think this is the last of it?" "No," the cowboy answered honestly. "It's not. But it doesn't have to start here." The wind picked up slightly, carrying loose snow between the two sides like a thin curtain. For a long minute, no one moved. Then a sound echoed from the far ridge, a shot. Not aimed at anyone, but fired into the air. Every horse jumped. Several men reached instinctively for their rifles. From the tree line west of town, another group of armed riders emerged. These were not the hesitant ranch hands. These were hardened men hired from beyond the valley, faces unfamiliar. Eyes sharp and cold, the tension snapped tight as wire. The crooked-legged man looked stunned. "I didn't call them," he muttered. The preacher's face went pale. The new riders spread out quickly, blocking the road toward town. Their leader raised his voice. "This valley needs order," he shouted. "And we're here to bring it." The cowboy felt a chill deeper than the winter air. This had grown beyond neighbors arguing over land. Outsiders with their own plans had stepped into the storm. The grandmother's horse shifted nervously. The child stepped back toward her. The lead native rider moved closer to the cowboy. "They will not listen," he said quietly. The cowboy kept his eyes on the new arrivals. "Maybe not to us," he replied. One of the hired men fired another shot into the air, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. "Disarm and step aside," their leader demanded. "We'll handle the rest." The ranch hands looked uncertain now. This was not what they had gathered for. They had come to prove a point, not to surrender control of their valley to strangers. The crooked-legged man hesitated, pride and doubt wrestling across his face. The preacher stepped forward again, voice rising above the noise. "This is not your fight," he called to the hired riders. "You don't know this land." "We know enough," their leader replied coldly. The cowboy felt every heartbeat in his chest. He could see the line tightening. One spark would set it all off. He nudged his horse forward once more, placing himself directly between the two groups. "You ride into our valley and start firing," he said steadily. "That's not order." "That's fear," the hired leader's eyes narrowed. "And who are you to say what's needed?" "Someone who lives here," the cowboy answered. Behind him, the grandmother's voice rose once more, stronger than before. "This land is watching," she said. "It will remember who chose hate and who chose mercy." Her words carried farther than expected. Even the hired men paused, unsettled by the calm certainty in her tone. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then thicker. The world turned quieter, as if waiting. The cowboy's hand hovered near his revolver, but did not draw. Around him, others held their breath. Between fear and mercy, between pride and understanding, the valley stood balanced on a knife's edge. And as the snow fell heavier, blurring the faces on both sides, it became clear that whatever happened next would shape more than this winter. It would shape every story told here long after the snow melted. The snow fell thicker, soft and steady, covering boots and hooves alike. For a long moment no one moved. The hired riders sat stiff in their saddles, eyes sweeping across the valley as if measuring how much fear they could stir. The ranch hands looked less certain now. This was no longer a show of strength between neighbors. This felt like something colder. The cowboy kept his horse planted firm in the snow. He did not reach for his revolver, he did not shout. He simply held his ground. "You don't belong here," he called to the hired leader. "This valley settles its own matters," the leader gave a short laugh. "Looks to me like you can't." Before the cowboy could answer, the crooked-legged ranch hand spoke up, louder than before. "We didn't ask for this," he said, glancing at the strangers beside him. "We came to talk." The hired men shifted uneasily. They had expected easy control, not divided loyalty. The preacher stepped forward again, snow gathering on his shoulders. "This ends now," he said firmly. "There will be no violence in this valley today." One of the hired riders started to argue, but an older rancher cut him off. "You fire another shot and you answer to all of us," he said. It was small, but it was the first clear sign that the valley was choosing itself over outside anger. The grandmother lifted her head, her eyes steady and clear despite the cold. The child stood close at her side, face calm in a way that seemed beyond their years. The hired leader studied the faces before him. He saw something shifting. The ranch hands were no longer fully behind him. The preacher stood unshaken. The cowboy remained in the open, unafraid. Fear thrives when people stand alone. It weakens when they stand together. Snow blurred the edges of the world. The sound of wind softened every breath. "You're making a mistake," the hired leader muttered, but his voice had lost its edge. "Maybe," the cowboy replied, "but it'll be our mistake." For several long seconds, no one moved. Then the hired leader gave a sharp nod to his men. They turned their horses without another word and rode back toward the west ridge. Their shapes faded into the falling snow, swallowed by distance and white. Silence settled again, but this time it was different. It was not tight with threat. It felt lighter. The crooked-legged ranch hand let out a slow breath he had been holding. He looked at the cowboy, then at the grandmother. "I didn't know," he said quietly. The grandmother's gaze softened. "Now you do," she answered. He slid off his horse, boots sinking deep into snow. He approached slowly, stopping a few steps short of the grandmother's horse. "What happened under that pine?" he said, his voice rough. "That wasn't right." The admission hung in the cold air. It did not fix everything. It did not erase fear or past harm. But it was a beginning. The child stepped forward again, small but steady. "We just want to go home," the child said. The words carried more truth than any speech. The preacher walked to stand beside the cowboy. "Then that is what we make sure happens," he said. One by one, the ranch hands lowered their rifles. The tension that had filled the field eased, replaced by something fragile but real. The crooked-legged man turned to the others. "We don't need hired guns telling us who we are," he said. "We handle our own valley." A few men nodded. Others stared at the snow, thinking. The cowboy felt something shift inside him, too. He had expected to stand alone when this ended. Instead, he saw neighbors choosing differently. The lead native rider guided his horse forward slightly. "We do not wish for war," he said. "We wish for safe passage. You'll have it," the older rancher replied. It was not shouted, it was not grand, it was spoken simply, like a promise. The grandmother looked toward the hills beyond town, where her family waited. "This land holds many stories," she said. "Let this be one that warms hearts." The cowboy felt the weight of her words. He had never thought of himself as part of something larger. Yet here he stood, in the middle of a valley, learning how to breathe again. The ranch hand stepped aside, clearing a path through the snow. The child climbed back onto the horse in front of the grandmother. Before they turned to leave, the child looked at the cowboy one last time. "Thank you," the child said softly. He nodded, unable to find the right words. The riders moved slowly through town, not as invaders, not as enemies, but as travelers heading home. People stepped out onto porches to watch. Some faces were wary, others thoughtful. The crooked-legged ranch hand remained behind in the field. He walked up beside the cowboy. "I let fear get the better of me," he admitted. Thought pushing back hard was the only way. The cowboy studied him. "Fear makes a loud voice," he said. "Hard to hear anything else over it." The ranch hand gave a faint nod. "You think this fixes everything?" "No," the cowboy said honestly. "But it's a start." They stood there as the riders disappeared beyond the east ridge. In the days that followed, the valley felt different. Not perfect, not free of tension, but changed. The preacher called for a gathering at the church. Ranchers, settlers, and a small group of native elders met under one roof. It was awkward at first. Words stumbled. Old grievances surfaced, but something had shifted. The image of a grandmother and child hanging in the snow lingered in every mind. It was hard to return to anger after seeing how close fear had come to crossing a line no one could justify. Agreements were made. Clear boundaries for travel, shared use of water in harsh winters. A promise that disputes would be spoken first, not acted out in the dark. It did not solve every future problem, but it laid ground for something steadier. The cowboy returned to his cabin that evening after the meeting. The snow had begun to melt slightly under a warmer sun. Water dripped from the roof in slow rhythm. He stepped inside and looked at the rug covering the trapdoor. The fire crackled softly. He thought about the moment under the pine tree, the rope creaking in the wind, the choice that had felt small and yet had carried so far. He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who had been present when it mattered. Weeks later, as winter loosened its grip, a small group of riders approached his cabin again. This time there was no tension in their posture. The grandmother rode at the front, looking stronger. The child waved as soon as they spotted him. They dismounted and shared warm bread and stories by the fire. The grandmother placed a small woven bracelet into his hand. "For courage," she said. He tried to refuse, but she closed his fingers around it. "You stood when others stepped back?" she added. The child smiled up at him. "Grandmother says stories travel far." He looked at the bracelet, then at the child. "Then make sure you tell it right," he said gently. Spring came slowly to the valley. Snow receded from the hills. Grass pushed through frozen ground. Fences were repaired, and cattle returned to open fields. The memory of that winter morning never fully faded. It became a quiet reminder that fear could freeze a heart as surely as snow, and that simple kindness could thaw it. The crooked-legged ranch hand stopped by the cabin one afternoon with a bundle of supplies. "For the trouble I caused," he said gruffly. The cowboy accepted it with a nod. "Valley's stronger when we look out for each other," the ranch hand added. "Reckon so?" the cowboy replied. Life did not turn into a perfect picture. There were still disagreements, still hard days. But there was also something new beneath it all. A shared understanding that violence born from fear left scars too deep to mend. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would hear the story. They would hear about a cowboy who found a native grandmother and child hanging in the snow. They would hear how he cut them down, not knowing what storm it would bring. And they would hear how that storm nearly broke the valley before teaching it something better. The cowboy never sought praise. He kept riding, mending fences, helping where he could. But whenever winter winds howled through the pines, he would pause and remember that morning. He would remember how close everything had come to shattering. And he would remember how, in the end, mercy proved stronger than fear. The valley did not forget either. It carried the lesson quietly through seasons of change. Sometimes the greatest battles are not won with force, but with the simple choice to see another human being clearly. And in that snow-covered clearing beneath a silent pine, that choice had melted more than ice.